World War III. What should America do to avoid it? To discuss, we have on today Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri emigrated from Russia at 13 in 1994, co-founded the leading cybersecurity startup Crowdstrike, and has spent the past 4 years running his new think tank, the Silverado Policy Accelerator. He's also the author of the new book, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Dmitri didn't have to write a book, or he could have just written a cyber book. But this is a much more ambitious take at, geopolitics and grand strategy. It has some deep reading of history. He's spent a lot of time traveling and talking to important people. And I think his, unique perspectives as an immigrant and also someone who didn't spend the past 20 years reading think tank reports, but matured professionally in a geopolitics-inflected world of cyber is a really refreshing kind of like insider-outsider look at the questions that we spend all our time on ChinaTalk meditating about. So really excited to have this chat. Dmitri, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan.
All right. So I want to start with the question that every normie friend of mine asks me whenever we catch up, which is if I think Xi is going to invade Taiwan. The answer I give to them kind of does the opposite of what you do in your book, which is tease out a lot of the contrasts that I see between Xi and Putin. So, from a professional backstory side, we have Putin, who was this spook who sort of stumbled in and lucked his way into power. And Xi, we have a man who's red aristocracy, who spent his whole career basically being a local politician and fixing potholes and doing economic growth, and only had 1 year on the national stage thinking about, geopolitics and defense before assuming the top position.
By the way, Putin, the same thing. He spent the 1990s being deputy mayor of St. Petersburg.
There we go. I think the sort of the biggest difference to me, though, is less the personal backstory than, what they've done in power. Putin, of course, he was blood was from, there was blood from the very beginning, with sort of Chechnya, and we've had wars that he's, basically started or got himself involved in throughout his entire, reign. Whereas with Xi, the real question, right, is because we don't have that, that track record. We have, all of these sort of obnoxious incursions and pushing the limit and salami slicing and whatnot, but we have nothing on the scale of a Ukraine 2014 or a Syria or a Georgia invasion. So my hope, and the thing I hold my hat on, Dmitri, is the fact that after 10 years in power, the guy might have already shown us who he is, which is not someone who's really ready to sort of roll the iron dice and takes, causing military death, something that is a little more weighty than, the way Putin has approached these sorts of questions of war and peace. So, I don't know, Dmitri, tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think you are wrong. Look, I think Putin is much more of a gambler than Xi. I agree with you on that. But I still think that Xi's a gambler. And I think when you look at some of the things that he has gambled on and has engaged in adventurism, whether it's the Sierra Madre in the South China Sea, whether it's the confrontation with India on the border there up north in India, whether it's zero COVID, I mean, the ultimate gamble, I mean, shutting down the whole country for several years, right, in the hopes of stopping a virus that spreads through air droplets, an incredible gamble. Crack down on the tech industry, an incredible gamble. Not on the scale of Ukraine 2022, but by the way, Putin had never gambled on that scale before either. And all the other conflicts you mentioned, whether it's Ukraine 2014, whether it's Syria, whether it's Georgia, or even Chechnya, were much, much smaller scale with much smaller stakes, right? But appetite grows with eating in the case of both men. And I think that, as they succeed in their gambles or don't receive pushbacks, they try for more, and ultimately you end up with the Ukraine 2022. I also think that she clearly wants to invade Taiwan, or at least have that option, right? You see that both from the intelligence community assessments that He's given the order for the military to be ready by 2027. The buildup that he's undertaking is specifically focused on that one thing, whether it's mass building of ro-ro ships, roll on and roll off ships, whether it's the building of Yushin amphibious assault ships and helicopter landing decks and the like. Those are not for just random power projection or blue water navy. They're focused on one thing and one thing only, which is how do we take this island? And he talks a lot about how he'd like to do it peacefully, but the option of using force is not off the table. Now, I think he's going to step into it cautiously, and the goal for him really is how do we keep America out, right? And I think that's been his strategy since day one of coming into power, is to increase his leverage over us economically, decrease our leverage over him economically, which is the reverse of, by the way, what I'm arguing we should be doing in my book with a grand strategy vis-a-vis China. Building the military capability that can inflict severe losses on American forces in the region so that we would be presented with a dilemma of, do we actually come to the defense of this island? And if we don't come to the defense of this island, I believe he'll be in a position to take it.
Yeah. So I still want to come back to the, eating more increases your appetite thing, because I think there are different dishes. And, there's protein and carbs and whatever. And it seems like, a more red meat thing is like rolling tanks into another country. And Putin did that twice, or 2.5 times, if you want to count Syria, before, really taking the biggest swing of his professional career. And, there is, we don't have nothing on the other side of the ledger. I'll grant you that, but I do still believe that there are sort of differences in degree and kind on the types of things that Xi has done. He hasn't seized an island, which is like a sort of thing that you could have expected if this was like really this guy's MO.
I think that would be counterproductive, and he knows that.
Well, I mean, people do counterproductive things all the time, right? Like, Xi has done counterproductive things, plenty of counterproductive things over the past 10 years. But anyways, I don't think we're going to resolve this. The sort of the broader macro takeaway for me is that, the percentage chance is not zero. And I think the dangers of underweighting are, probably, or maybe I'll ask you this question, Dmitri, like, how do you see the dangers of underweighting versus like overweighting the risk of the leader and a leader in China wanting to take Taiwan?
Well, I think the greatest risk is miscalculating the risk of war, right? I actually think that even if there is 5% chance that he might do it, we got to do everything in our power to make sure this doesn't happen, because I think him going for Taiwan would result in one of two things: a disastrous war that would cause a global depression, numerous losses for obviously Taiwanese, for us, potentially our allies, if we fight the war, or a takeover of Taiwan that would diminish our power in Asia and potentially globally over time. So even if the risk is small, we got to make sure that we drive it down to zero as much as possible, and that needs to be the overarching focus of American foreign policy.
Sure. So, we've had this big debate in foreign affairs over the past week about endgame. What do you set the bar? How would you set the bar or lodestar for U.S. policy towards China over the next 20 years?
Yeah, so I wrote my own piece on that endgame in foreign affairs, where I compare the situation in Taiwan to what was happening in West Berlin in the late 1950s, 1960s. And look, my basic position is that we are unquestionably in a Cold War II with China. I mean, the similarities between the two conflicts, as I write in the book, are just absolutely eerie. You've got a global competition for supremacy. You've got an ideological struggle. You've got an arms race. You've got a space race. You've got a spy war. You've got a major regional flashpoint, a scramble for bases, economic warfare, and just preparations for war. All of these things that we had during the first Cold War, and really like the one argument that people use to say, well, we're not in a Cold War, is economic interdependence, which, by the way, is decreasing by the day. as there is de-risking or selective decoupling, whatever you want to call it, that's taking place on both sides, by the way, as China's been focused on that for a decade or more. Made in China 2025 is literally that plan. But also, as I write in my book, this is completely selective memory where people assume that the Soviet Union and the West had no economic dealings whatsoever. And as I write in the book, there was actually massive amounts of loans that would be given to the Warsaw Pact countries to sustain their economies. The entire oil and gas industry of the Soviet Union was running off Western technology that was sold to them. Of course, they were exporting that oil and gas to Europe and elsewhere. They were exporting wheat. So you had quite a bit of economic connections, even during the height of the Cold War. Not the same scale as China, absolutely, but the trend lines are very similar. So, but if you're in a Cold War, what is that grand strategy for victory? And I believe, just like in the first Cold War, the grand strategy is containment. The grand strategy is avoiding a hot war and preventing expansionism. And we did that very well in 1961 and before that with West Berlin. And in fact, as I highlight in the book and in the adapted piece for Foreign Affairs, the Berlin Wall, as maligned as it is and as devastating as it was for people living on the eastern side of it, was actually a good thing for the Cold War, because it stabilized the Cold War, because it really signified that the risk of a hot conflict between America and the Soviet Union had diminished dramatically. And in fact, Kennedy celebrated the building of the Cold War when he learned about it in August of 1961. He said, thank God, right? If he's building the wall, he's not invading. And by the way, the risks of hot war that whole summer of 1961 were perhaps the greatest that they've ever been throughout the whole Cold War. Kennedy was on television the month prior telling the American public to get ready for nuclear war, asking Congress for funding for fallout shelters. He said, we're going to defend West Berlin at all costs, including at the risk of nuclear conflict. And once the wall started to get built, he realized that we pulled back from the brink. The conflict stabilized. The Cold War still went on. Of course, there's Vietnam, Afghanistan invasion by the Soviets, and so forth. But it led to, I believe, the detente in the 1970s that could not have happened if there was a real threat of a daily risk of war over Berlin, as there had been in the 60s and 50s and really late 40s as well, with the Berlin airlift and the like. So that stabilization of the conflict enabled us to get to a much better place in the Cold War, where you could have arms control, you could have discussions. The Cold War still went on, the competition was still quite acute, but the risk of actual conflict diminished. And I think we could get to the same place in China if we built sort of a metaphorical wall, or bowling mode, as Matt Pottinger would call it in his book, across the Taiwan Strait. In other words, deter China from ever trying to take this island, because that is really the only place where the United States and China has a potential to go to war. We're not going to fight over some rocks in South China Sea. We're not going to fight over some rocks in East China Sea. It is all about Taiwan. And if that threat diminished, as it basically diminished throughout the 80s and 90s, right, where there was no fear in the United States on a daily basis that China is about to take Taiwan, Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid 90s aside, you had this potential for better relationship and trade and so forth, and you could get back to some semblance of that. Now, I think we've made a lot of mistakes throughout that 45 years of enabling China and not penalizing them for IP theft and unfair trade practices and the like. So if we get back to better relationships, we got to make sure that it's much more of an equal relationship versus one-sided.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, you could get to some semblance of that. And we can survive. And the reason we can survive is that it's now very clear that China is not a diminishing power, and the United States is not.
Okay, we'll get there. So I want to stay on this question of like, which period of the Cold War do we want to be queuing off of? Because I think that was the key distinction that I read in a lot of the pieces of Jessica Chenweiss and Rush Doshi and Gallagher and Pottinger and yours, is like, on the one hand, we have this like brave stand that Kennedy and then later Reagan took.
I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable, and so was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is tenable if brave men will make it so. We do not want to fight, but we have fought before, and others in earlier times have made the same dangerous mistake of assuming that the West was too selfish and too soft and too divided to resist invasions of freedom in other lands. Those who threaten to unleash the forces of war on a dispute over West Berlin should recall the words of the ancient philosopher, "A man who causes fear cannot be free from fear." We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin, either gradually or by force. For if the fulfillment of our pledge to that city, our pledge to that city is essential to the morale and security of West Germany, to the unity of the entire free world.
Like, that raises the blood. I think gets people really excited to compete or whatever. But it is also a fact that the two presidents that were most kind of like aggressively, rhetorically in favor of drawing lines in the sand and taking it to USSR, Kennedy and Reagan, were also the ones in which we had our scariest moments, right? With the Berlin Wall crisis, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then with Abel Archer in 1983. So the argument that I think you and Pottinger and Gallagher are making is something like, we're going to have to get through a like tighter, a sort of scarier moment where we really put our cards on the table and sort of change the, make the like long-term strategic, like military balance of power, national power trajectory clear to China. But once we kind of get past that, then you can start exploring more of these like, deterrence mode, like, okay, the risk of war is lower, so we can like find some more comfortable ways of living with each other. Am I reading history wrong? That interpretation.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you're misreading Gallagher and Pottinger a little bit because they're both friends, but I don't actually agree with their piece because they're not calling for coexistence with the CCP, right? They're calling for victory over the CCP, which I'm not. I'm perfectly willing to coexist with the CCP, and I'm kind of done with regime change adventurism. So I have no interest in regime change in China, nor do I think we have any chance of actually even enacting it, even if we wanted to. But yeah, I think you are. I mean, first of all, Abel Archer has been pretty much discredited lately with the documents that have come out of the Soviet Union, that this was not as dangerous of a period as people once thought, and it all stems from Gordievsky's defection. He was a KGB agent that defected to MI6 in Britain in the 1980s, and we now know a lot more about what was happening, and that this was a lot less scary than has been presented. But 1961 and obviously 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which originated from the West Berlin crisis, was very, very scary. But of course, it wasn't the only time when West Berlin was a crisis. In fact, the late Eisenhower administration was dealing with this issue on a pretty much daily basis, and was very concerned about the prospect of war. Truman was dealing it in the late 1940s with the Berlin airlift. So that threat has been present. It became more acute in 1961, but I don't think it became more acute because of anything that Kennedy did. Because that Khrushchev was pushing his advantage, right? And they had that summit in Vienna where Kennedy went into that summit wanting better relationships. He wanted to convince Khrushchev. He sent him messages when he first came to power of, our countries need to work together on issues, right? War is not the answer. Let's talk. And he came away out of Vienna shocked that Khrushchev was completely uninterested in that. And the only thing that he wanted to talk about was pushing Americans and their allies out of West Berlin. And he decided that he had to make a stand and push back, which ultimately worked because Khrushchev, of course, blinks. And then you do have a better relationship that probably would have improved significantly had Kennedy not been assassinated in 1963, but ultimately did anyway with Nixon in the 1970s. So that trajectory, I think, was going to take place no matter what. That's where I think the similarities are their strongest. We have a lot to learn from that period of the Cold War, of how to keep it cold, but also not allow your adversary to get a strategic advantage.
So you mentioned earlier, Dmitri, this like idea that like you're just long America from a like long-term national power perspective relative to China. I don't think, we probably can skip the like the China bear story, but what is sort of striking to me before we get into the particulars is like the people I talk to nowadays who are most like sanguine about America's future are immigrants from China, immigrants from Russia, and immigrants from Iran.
As immigrants.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you look, we have the unique perspective as immigrants to have lived in countries elsewhere and have come here because we think this is a much better place. And by the way, we're not the only ones. I mean, if you look at our border, and I'm not a fan of open borders and uncontrolled immigration, but the fact that you have thousands of people literally every day trying to get across that border is an indication of something. No one is trying to get across the Chinese border and trying to live there, right? We are the place that people want to live in, that can create a better life for themselves and for their children. We have unbelievable advantages on innovation, on access to capital, our influence around the world in terms of our alliance networks and partners around the world, the power of our ideas, immigration. Again, like we can do a lot better on immigration. I think we should have a merit-based immigration program. But that all aside, the fact is we're still benefiting from people coming in and their children growing up and contributing to this country, as I had an opportunity to do. We have all these advantages that China does not. And, I actually think that China is a lot weaker than the Soviet Union was during the Cold War, and we beat them. So for sure, we can beat the Chinese and make sure that this century remains an American century. But the first thing we got to do is avoid a conflict or avoid losing Taiwan. Both of these would be disastrous outcomes.
Yeah. So, running through a few more of the sort of national power benefits you've ticked off that we've also sort of discussed on ChinaTalk in the past, we have sort of alliance networks or technological innovation, immigration, and, a political system that like is a little more flexible for good and for ill sometimes, than, your run-of-the-mill Leninist regime.
By the way, access to capital is huge, right? I could never have started Crowdstrike anywhere else, right? We raised $25 million right off the bat of PowerPoint slides. Name me a country in Europe or elsewhere where I could have done that. I couldn't, right? So the VC network, the private equity network, the fact that we have more banks per capita than anywhere else in the world is something that is completely underappreciated in this conversation as well.
So, I'm with you. And I think it's worth sort of running through all of those and like the risk factors that are facing them. We're talking about Taiwan a lot, so let's lead with defense. You have this great line. It's one of the world's great ironies and frankly scandals that the United States boasts one of the planet's largest defense budgets, and yet also, as the Ukraine war has persisted, finds itself critically short of numerous necessary armaments. I mean, like, what gives here?
What gives is that, and the reason really I wanted to write this book is that our strategy, certainly over the last 20 years and arguably even longer, has been messed up. All right. We've been focused on the wrong things. We've been distracted. In the defense industrial base in particular, we've become enamored with highly exquisite, highly capable, but incredibly expensive platforms that we can no longer afford and arguably could never afford to buy in the quantities that are necessary. And as the saying goes, quantity has a quality of its own. And we got to get back to the basics. We got to manufacture at scale. And, the Ford aircraft carrier is a perfect example of this. By the way, I'm not one of those people that doesn't believe that aircraft carriers are not important or are obsolete. They're absolutely essential for power projection. We still need them, and we'll need them for the foreseeable future. But we have the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier that is head and shoulders above in capabilities of anyone else's in the world. China's, Russia, well, Russia doesn't really have aircraft carriers, but the French, you name it. And we decided to get an upgrade, right? We went to the Ford class, and the Nimitz class cost $4 billion. The Ford class cost nearly $14 billion. And I can tell you, we did not get 3.5 times the value, right? And why not stick with the Nimitz? It was perfectly fine. Keep buying the same thing. $4 billion is not chump change, but it's not 14. And at $14 billion, how many can you really afford, particularly with the deficit and the debt where it is today? So just on every level, we go for the most expensive we can get. We've gotten rid of the competition in the defense industrial base by consolidating it so much. in the 1990s. I write about this Last Supper that took place during the Clinton administration, where they brought all the defense contractor primes together and said, you better start merging because we're not going to be funding all of you. All of that was a mistake, and unfortunately led us to where we are today, where we have capability to produce one Virginia class sub per year when we need 2 or 2.5 really. Our shipbuilding capacity has been decimated. Our ability to produce munitions at scale, whether it's Javelin missiles or Stingers or anti-ship missiles, is nowhere near where it needs to be, not to mention artillery. So we know how to do this. This is not hard. This is not rocket science. And I'm not even advocating for increases of the defense budget. The defense budget, $900 billion, is an enormous defense budget. Now, some of it is, a huge part of it is personnel costs and other things. But nevertheless, you could take that $900 billion and spend it much more wisely.
Sure. So, like, is your diagnosis, like, is this captured interests in political economy? Is there just like, does no one care? Because if it's not a money question, like, people have been screaming about this for 15 years, right? And now we don't even have other wars in the Middle East as excuses not to focus on this stuff. Like, what are just Boeing lobbyists really good? Like, what's the root cause here, you think?
Well, some of that is certainly the lobbying and the political patronage of plants in your district and the like. But I think the bigger issue that transcends actually even the defense industrial base and you see it in semiconductor policy as well, is that we get enamored with the most advanced, with the highly capable. We want to be at the leading edge of innovation. We want always to have the best that we can possibly get. And anytime someone out there invents something that is better than ours in any industry, we're immediately screaming, we got to catch up. This is our own Sputnik moment, right? Yeah. You see this in hypersonics, by the way, which I think are pretty much a useless weapon today at the cost at which they're being procured, right? $60 million roughly for a missile. Tell me how many targets you have that are worth expending that much money over. And by the way, you know what else you can do to bypass air defenses if you don't have hypersonics? A large number of conventional missiles, right? So, Tomahawks that cost $2 million a pop, literally 10 or 15 of those can penetrate most air defense sites because you can basically overwhelm them with your incoming strike package. Still half the cost of one hypersonic, right? So just because China is spending all this money on hypersonics does not mean that we need to follow them over the cliff and do the same thing until the price drops, right? So continue the research, but don't procure it because it's just a waste of money, in my view. But on semiconductors, right? And I know you've covered this on ChinaTalk a lot, but we're so enamored that we got to get to the leading edge. We got to get to 2 nanometers before the evil Taiwanese do it or Koreans, and that's all fine and good, but completely forgetting about what I call foundational chips, some call mature and legacy, which I think is a misnomer as a term, which are way more important for everything, right? You can't build a single electronics without those chips. And the policy is basically, well, China can own all that, which is just absolutely ridiculous and is a strategic threat. Now, there's some changes, in fairness to that lately with the tariffs that are being announced and so forth, although not going anywhere close to far enough. But, you've seen this in Congress in particular, where the CHIPS Act basically allocated very, very little money to foundational chip fabs, and the Commerce Department rightly pushed back and got a little bit more, but still nothing close to what we're spending on advanced. So you just see this across the board, where our enamorment with being at the very leading edge of innovation in all these areas is sometimes counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, right? Because you like national characteristics or whatever, like there's like upsides to that. And it's sort of it actually comes to another thing I want to discuss. Dmitri, can you talk about your story of the Twitter thread and your chat with Jake Sullivan? I think it's probably cleaner.
Okay, yeah. Well, I retired from Crowdstrike in 2020 and started Silverado really to focus on China and this Cold War and how to win it, and the national security sphere and the trade sphere, technology sphere. But in late 2021, because I was still keeping an interest on Russia that I'd followed closely since I left, and on Putin in particular, I became convinced that this invasion was going to take place that winter, and I went public with that on Twitter, outlining all the reasons why. And Jake Sullivan called me, and we had a number of conversations throughout that winter. And one of the things that I suggested to Jake as they were going into one of the negotiations with the Russians was to put on the table the idea that we would abandon the so-called open door policy of NATO membership to Ukraine. And the way I justify it is at that point, Biden had already come out because he was asked by the media. He had ruled out sending American troops to fight for Ukraine, no matter what happened. And my point was, well, that is sort of the core condition of Article 5, right? That if we admit Ukraine into NATO, then you got to be willing to send American troops to fight and die for the country. And Biden has just ruled it out. So why would you ever, if you're not willing to do it today, why would you ever do it in the future? It seemed like a contradictory policy to talk about that one day Ukraine will join NATO, but yet we're not willing to fight for them. And not that I seriously believe that it would be enough for Putin, but I thought it would be worthwhile to explore just to gauge the Russian reaction. And of course, the Biden policy was that the open door policy stays, and they were not willing to withdraw it. But I don't think it would have deterred conflict anyway.
But so I guess like the reason I wanted you to tell that story is I think there is like something like that makes a lot of sense. Jake Sullivan is probably like the sharpest, most logical, rational national security advisor we can hope for. But like we have a fundamentally like incoherent like government, right? With different sources of power, different competing interests. Like, Biden has his domestic concerns, what have you. Like the sort of level of like harmony that you are going to get out of the out of the American political system to like compete China and, rationalize your defense spending and like do a good job with industrial policy and whatever the other, have smart immigration policies, whatever 20 things that could like increase national power, like from a direct policy perspective, the American system is kind of trading off, right? The sort of like rationalization that you can like think you have in China or the Soviet Union for this like, free exchange of ideas, like vibrant society that like people want to live in, and that just happens to be the one country that like can actually keep growing as a developed economy. So I guess my question to you, Dmitri, is like, do you buy that there is sort of like a ceiling in how coherent America can be, thinking back through the history of the Cold War and into today, and like, what are the sort of parameters?
I think it's a recent phenomenon.
Okay.
I think it's a recent phenomenon. I think it started with Carter in 1979. In fact, possibly the worst period of American foreign policy ever, with the Carter presidency, not just the Iran crisis and the Afghanistan invasion by the Soviets, and I think the opening of China. Kissinger and Nixon get so much of the blame when in reality they didn't do anything, right? They went over to China, they got the pocket all the benefits of improved relations that they immediately used to get a detente with the Soviet Union, right? Mao was livid at Kissinger. He called him a bad man in private conversations with Kim Il-sung because he thought that they were cheated because, of course, they didn't reverse recognition on Taiwan. They didn't pull troops out of Taiwan, and Kissinger kept telling the Chinese, well, we'll get to it. We'll get to it. He said it during the Nixon era. He said it during the Ford era. Never did a thing, right? And then Brzezinski and Carter come along in 1979, decide to pay Chinese back for all the things that we've already gotten, and not really getting anything back in return for it, because by that point, the Soviet and the Chinese relationship was already on the upswing. In 1982, just 3 years later, it improves dramatically. In 86, with Gorbachev, it becomes much tighter as well. So, that was a complete disaster, in my view, to reopen China without any sort of guardrails and asking for them to pay back for it, right? And I think it actually led to the situation that we have today because, we blame the Taiwanese for not having a good defense strategy. Well, why do we think that is? Because we left 45 years ago. American troops left from Taiwan. And not only did we leave, but we basically broke off all high-level contacts, right? No active general officer is allowed to talk to the Taiwanese officially, and visit Taiwan. And they've been essentially living in a bubble for 45 years, right? So it's as if someone was on Mars and they get back to this planet, and you're wondering why they don't have a modern defense strategy and modern way of thinking about war. Well, we're partially to blame for that. And I think that the lofty rhetoric that began with Carter and Brzezinski as well on human rights and sort of this bright vision of America around the world that continued under Reagan and certainly Clinton and Bush and so forth really has served us not well at all, because the hard-nosed realpolitik that we had during the Nixon era and even prior to that was focused on our interests, and this idea that we're going to spread freedom and democracy around the world, fight for human rights, was always hypocritical, because of course, as we were talking all these lofty goals, we were in close alignment with Saudi Arabia and all kinds of nefarious dictatorships around the world, and continue to be to this day, and B, actually working against our interests, right? And you see this with the Biden administration when they announced their summit of democracies. They excluded who? Singapore, Bangladesh, right? Not to mention all these Middle Eastern countries. So at the same time as you're talking with this us versus them rhetoric of democracies versus authoritarianism, you're telling all these countries that could be friends of ours or partners at least, that you should go look to the other side because we don't want you in our camp. How is that a smart policy? It's ridiculous.
So Dmitri, cool. I think that was like a good take on the international dimensions of like incoherent, waging strategic competition. But the sort of domestic side is one that I feel like folks are, underappreciating or taking for granted a little bit when it comes to China. Can you maybe reflect a little bit about how Putin was so incredibly successful in sort of turning chunks of the Republican Party and different pieces of, or I guess not even Republican Party, turning chunks of America and the EU into kind of like not caring all that much that he invaded Ukraine? I mean, like, we really got to a point where you needed to have a speaker like literally come to Jesus in order to get this thing passed, which should have happened, a year ago.
Look, I don't think we should give Putin any credit for that whatsoever. In fact, our sort of focus on Putin and what he did in 2016 has been counterproductive, because we made him look like he's 10 foot tall. He was not, right? Virtually everything that has happened since 2016 in terms of divisions and the polarization of this country is our fault. Let's put the credit where it belongs, with us. And yes, there's foreign influence by Russia, by China, by Iran in our elections, in our political systems. It is minuscule compared to the domestic disinformation and misinformation that is spread by people on the left and the right. So let's be very, very realistic about this, and this is one of the reasons why I don't spend a lot of my time actually worrying about foreign interference, because I don't think it actually has that much effect when you compare it with the flood of polarization that we experience on a daily basis domestically, that of course you can't do anything about because of the First Amendment. So who cares that the Chinese or the Russians are doing this or that that's out there on the margins? But look, this is not a unique period in American history where we're divided. I mean, we've had the Civil War, we've got the Vietnam War, we've got the Civil Rights Movement, we've got the Revolutionary War, right, where we're literally fighting each other. Our families were going up against families. So we're nowhere near that level of division. And the one thing that I think I take solace from is that we've overcome all of these great challenges that we faced as a country. And one of the ways in which we had overcome them, aside from the Civil War, where we actually fought a war, is by focusing on the external threat that has always been a unifying force for America. Obviously, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Nazi Germany in the 1940s and the like. And today that is China, right? As divided as this town is, you and I know that China is the one thing that is bipartisan, largely bipartisan in this town, right? That's how we got the CHIPS Act passed. That's how we got, even the aid to Ukraine passed, despite the fact that a chunk of the Republican Party was opposed to it. But the sweetener was the aid for Taiwan, the focus on the Indo-Pacific, the focus on China. The Biden administration's China policy is largely a continuation of the Trump one, right? So that is the one bright spot that we have, that when appreciating the external threat, the risk of an actual conflict with a nuclear power, we tend to come together, not on everything, but at least on the things that matter.
Yeah, I mean, that's a optimistic read. Like, look, I think Donald Trump would have had a very different take on Putin invading Ukraine if it happened under his watch. And sort of what he's kind of done to the sort of discourse in the Republican Party with respect to, you know, one autocrat in particular, and maybe another autocrat if he comes back into the presidency again, is pretty remarkable. You know, I had Matt Pottinger on the show, and I asked him, like, what would Trump do on Taiwan? It seems like he's just crossing his fingers and hoping for the best. Like, this is not a guy who is super confident that if Trump becomes comes back to the presidency again, he's gonna like agree with the sort of way that, like the worldview that you see in this. And like, look, if all Trump cares about is trade, the balance of trade and like nothing else, then I don't think you end up adopting a lot of the sort of like policy prescriptions and overall outlook that that you have, because even if, there is this bipartisan consensus, like presidents have a lot of power and they set the tone for their party. And it seems like pretty, like, I think like whatever the difference between, Carter and Reagan and Ford and Nixon, like they all kind of bought into the idea that like the Soviet Union wasn't cool. And we had Trump, who's like kind of admires like going to the palace and like thinks it's awesome that Putin has like shiny stuff in his house. And I mean, I don't even know where to start. But
No, but he talks a lot about China and how China is screwing us and so forth. Look, I'm not here to defend Donald Trump, and I don't think even Donald Trump knows what he would do. Some of his policies on China were really good, some of them not so good, and comments on Taiwan I think were quite unhelpful. At least in private. But the reality is that he's very unpredictable. And there's a positive side to this, right? The madman theory that, Xi Jinping is not going to know what this guy is going to do, right? The Soleimani is case in point, where the military, threw in that option just as a by the way so that we can have three options, not expecting him to take that one at all. And he's like, I like that one. Let's assassinate one of the key guys in Iran, right? Everyone was shocked by that, right? But in the end, it actually, I think, had a deterrent effect on Iran. And who knows what he would do? Maybe he would abandon Taiwan. Maybe he would fight for it and even threaten nuclear war over it. Not that I am in favor of that, but the fact that he's so unpredictable can actually unnerve the Chinese, right? And give them some pause. Again, there are positives and negatives here, but I think anyone that knows what Donald Trump is going to do is deluding themselves, because I think the last term of his has shown that if anything, he's completely unpredictable.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is, like, look, Nixon, he did the madman theory, but he knew it was an act, and like, there's no like ego.
Maybe
ego
it's even better when it's not an act, right? When the guy is completely unpredictable, where people are not trying to figure out.
Okay, so Dmitri, I want to come back to your idea of like, like the election interference and Putin, like we shouldn't give him enough credit. But I do think that like, even if, he and his bot farms are not directly responsible for, changing votes or the outcome of the election, which like some people have different degrees on. I do think that Putin has positioned himself in a way that sort of resonates with some parts of the American discourse, where they like see him as this like strong, impressive, whatever leader. And she basically has not, in any sense of the word, any sense of the world. And, you have this whole like litany of how he just like has alienated basically like everyone on the planet. This isn't necessarily baked in. Mao, Zhou Enlai, they had a lot of friends and a lot of sort of people who looked up to, their leadership and the way they ran their country. And one of the other sort of risks of this, that faces this bipartisan consensus and growing, in growing global consensus, I guess, that like China is a problem and needs to be competed with, is the fact that like Xi himself has been so heavy-handed in like just not being subtle about what its aims and methods and means are. And I guess I'm curious, like Dmitri, to what extent do you think that a smarter leader, or maybe after Xi, who wants to play his well, not really his cards in a different way, could actually like dramatically change the balance or correlation of global forces on this question?
No question, right? Xi Jinping has been a gift to us. Now, that's only going to be true up until the moment he invades, right? But to this point, I joke that if he's not an American agent, we should put him on the payroll because, by God, everything he has done has been to the detriment of China and to the benefit of the United States, virtually everything. And he just can't help himself. And the Wolf Warrior thing has not really gone away. People sort of assume, oh, that's done and over. And let me just give you one example. From February of this year, I go to this Munich security conference every year. Been going there for a dozen years. And this year, I was in a session there on supply chain resiliency. And there was like the Indians there, the Chinese, the Australians, the Japanese, the US. And it was going to be like a pretty non-controversial session just talking about supply chain resiliency in lieu of, supply chain disruptions post-COVID, right? And it began with an Indian representative from the BJP basically saying, look, we're open for business. We're manufacturing iPhones. Businesses should come to India. We're so great, blah, 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 right? And then the Chinese guy gets on the mic and he turns to the Indian guy and he starts off with, the West, they're trying to divide us. They're turning us into good students and bad students, and we can't let that happen. We got to unite together. And then, without skipping a beat, he turns away from the Indian guy, faces the rest of the audience there, right? It was a kind of oval-shaped table, and says, by the way, no one should be doing anything with India. We've got all the supply chains. We've got all the workers. We've got the huge markets. India's not going to help you. Come to China. Don't go to India. Everyone's like, what just happened here? Like, are you kidding me? And then the Indian guy had the best comeback I've ever heard. He gets back on the mic and he says, we might be students, but we don't need a master teacher. So these guys just can't help themselves, right? There's not going to be any alienation between the Indians and Chinese on this topic, and they barreled through it. And this happens, so much because they feel so self-confident right now. They think that this is their time, that they've arrived, they're the world's greatest power, or about to be. Of course, none of that is true, but as long as they keep thinking that, that's great for us because I think it's actually becomes more dangerous if they think that they're diminishing power and then chance is slipping. And the self-confidence inevitably creates arrogant behavior, which is, by the way, not unique to the Chinese. I mean, everyone does it, and God knows we've done it for many decades as well. But I think that plays hugely to our favor.
Yeah. So, like the post-Xi kind of question, it's like hard to like drawing direct parallels to like, are we going to get a Brezhnev? Are we going to get a Gorbachev? Like they aren't great, but they're kind of all we have. Because pre-Xi was so sui generis. I mean, sort of, we had like revolutionary leaders basically through the whole time, and like Xi has been the first one sort of after that like cohort. And I don't think like did like. I mean, maybe I should learn more Vietnamese history or something to think about different transitions. But I mean, like, what is the mindset? What is the most realistic worldview and mindset that you can hope the Xi successor has in the contemporary, for whatever the contemporary CCP is going to spit out? And, to what extent, if at all, do you think, based on, your reading of Soviet history, like the US and friends can help sort of shape that, whatever the worldview of the person who wins that next fight is?
I don't think there's anything we can do to shape that whatsoever. And this parlor game of trying to predict who the next leader is, I think is interesting, but completely irrelevant. And honestly, what I worry about is Xi's term, not because it's Xi, or not just because it's Xi, but also because of the time frame, right? I believe, as I write in the book, that the period of 2028 through 2032 is potentially the most dangerous, could be the most dangerous this century. Because I'm convinced that he wants to unify Taiwan on his own watch, because he's so ego-driven, just like Putin, that he wants to have this notch on his belt where he can go down into the pantheon of Chinese history and basically claim credit for it, right? In 27, of course, as you know, he gets very likely reelected in the Chinese Communist Party Congress. And, in the second half of 28, he's kind of past all of the transition periods of new ideological thoughts and new people to place on the Politburo and the like, and so forth. So his hand gets kind of freed. And by the way, 28 is an interesting year because the world is going to be pretty distracted, right? You've got the Taiwanese elections in January, the inauguration potentially of a new president in May. Well, there will be inauguration. Whether it's a new president or not, I guess is questionable. You've got the Los Angeles Olympics taking place that summer, very distracting for the United States, and of course our own elections, where we know, regardless of who wins in November, it won't be Donald Trump or Biden on the ballot in November of 2028. So you could potentially have a transition to a new president, a lame duck administration. So very, very distracting. So that opens up a window for him potentially. And I think that window could close, at least in his mind, in 2032, because that's the end of his fifth term. He's going to be 79, looking both at the twilight of his power and career, but also potentially his life. He doesn't look like the most healthy person in the world to me. So who knows if he's going to be even in good health shape at that point. And here's the thing, right? So whoever comes next in 32, or even if he does get another term shortly thereafter, is going to be facing a very different regional dynamic situation. The reason we are where we are and this period is so dangerous is because we dropped our eye off the ball. The Taiwanese did, the Japanese did, right? For the last 20 years, as the Chinese were undergoing this massive military buildup, we were fighting wars in the Middle East. We were not reforming our industrial base and so forth. Well, that is changing, right? And we're trying desperately to catch up. And I think in the mid-30s to early 40s, that starts to change dramatically, where this operation that is already incredibly difficult to occupy Taiwan becomes next to impossible because of what the Taiwanese are doing, because of what the Japanese are doing, because of what we're doing, AUKUS and the like, the submarines coming online. So all of those things are going to make it so much more difficult for them. So it almost doesn't matter if it's Xi Jinping's successor that has the exact same thoughts and policies as he does, or someone that is a new Gorbachev. I think you're going to get into a better state vis-a-vis this potential invasion, which is really what we need to get the Cold War on a better footing.
U.S. troops on Taiwan. Dmitri, what's your take?
Well, look, I don't think we should be putting U.S. troops on Taiwan anytime soon. This is very, very provocative. But look, if we have insight that China is literally, weeks away from launching an invasion, and this is the only way to deter them, that might become a possibility at some point. But right now, we need to focus on other things in terms of building up Taiwanese capabilities. Look, this is very, very difficult. I don't know if you spend much time on Taiwan, but just visiting that place and walking around that terrain, as I have with my friend Ivan Kanapathy, who is the Taiwan military attaché to Taiwan and was on the National Security Council in the Trump administration. This is a hellish place to invade. I would not want to be the Chinese that are planning this invasion, right? This is so difficult. But of course, it's only difficult if the Taiwanese have done enough to make it difficult and use advantages of that terrain, which, in my view, they really haven't done as much as they need to, and pushing them to do more of this, and pushing us and our defense department to engage more with the Taiwanese on this issue, I think is really important. We self-deter a lot on the connections with Taiwan, right? The fact that we can't send a general officer to Taiwan, even a one-star, to talk to them and actually walk the terrain and talk about how you would defend this, that's ridiculous. First of all, Congress passed a law that authorizes this. And what are the Chinese going to do? Are they going to stop trading with us? Are they going to invade Taiwan because we sent a one-star over? Is that more provocative than sending Speaker Pelosi, which got us absolutely nothing but an escalation in the relationships? I think if you're going to do provocative things, don't do them for show, like have a speaker visit, but actually do them for things that matter, which is mill-to-mill relations and helping the Taiwanese get better.
Let's talk about this idea of unidirectional entanglement. So when you talk about the sort of technological and economic strategy that you think the West should pursue, you say that the pursuit of one-way selective decoupling that also increases the coupling in the other direction to achieve the kind of equilibrium that achieves peace. Tease that out for us.
Yeah, and by the way, this is not a unique strategy because this is exactly the strategy that China has been pursuing for 20 plus years, right? Which is to increase our dependence on them and decrease their dependence on us. So that asymmetric dependence is what I argue we should be doing, right? We should not be decoupling from China wholesale. A, that's really impossible given the volume of trade that exists. B, we can't get any of our allies to go on board with that. And C, it's counterproductive because if you have no economic relations, you actually have no leverage, right? And we want more leverage over them to try to deter this action and other nefarious actions that they may be engaging in. So I argue in the book that this century will be determined by whoever dominates in 4 critical technology areas: AI and autonomy, self-explanatory for your listeners; biotech and synthetic biology, also I think you guys have talked a lot about, not just the medical sciences space, but in bioenergetics, biomanufacturing, really, really exciting stuff that's coming online and will be revolutionary, I think, in the coming decades. Space, aerospace technology, particularly low Earth orbit, and the revolution you're seeing there with the cheap space lift capacity that SpaceX really pioneered and others are adopting as well with reusable rockets. And last one is green energy, right? And on the first 3, we're kind of leading, not by a lot, but particularly in AI, I think the gap is growing more and more because of our export control policies on chips, on semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The gap between our AI research and China's AI research is widening by the day. Biotech and synthetic biology, I think, kind of piggybacks on that because I think AI is going to be at the core of the advances in that space. In space, we're ahead right now, thanks to SpaceX, thanks hopefully soon to Amazon and their Kuiper installation. And the good news is there that time matters, and we're projecting that there'll be 50,000 satellites in low Earth orbit by the end of the decade from us. And if China doesn't get their act together quickly here, there's not going to be enough space for them to go up into low Earth orbit because we're going to take all the slots. So whoever gets to that valuable real estate first kind of wins by default. And then, of course, on green energy, we're losing so badly, whether it's EVs or batteries, solar, wind, etc. So, and then in addition to those 4 critical technologies, you have the 2 components that are essential for success in them, which is semiconductors and critical minerals. And again, on critical minerals, we're in terrible shape because of the processing and refining that's happening in China, as well as their attempts to acquire all these mining rights around the world. And on semiconductors, I think we're kind of on a knife's edge where we've done fairly good job, although not as comprehensive as I would like, to limit their ability to produce advanced chips, but barely have done anything on foundational, which is really, really vital. And we could find ourselves in a situation where the Chinese will completely dominate that space in the next 2 to 3 years and make us much more dependent on them. So in each one of those areas, we got to focus on how do we preserve our advantage and our innovation so that we're leading in this, and how do we slow China down, right, through export controls and other economic measures to prevent them from gaining a critical advantage, and also punish them for dumping and overcapacity that you're seeing in the critical mineral space and the green energy space and the like. So the goal here is to be winning the race for the 21st century in those critical technology areas, but also making sure that China is as reliant as possible in as many of those areas as possible to give us leverage, right? Because ultimately, deterrence is about influencing the mind of one man, right? The man that is running China today, Xi Jinping. And you don't know what's going to be sufficient, right? It could be that just military deterrence and more anti-ship and naval capabilities in the region is going to be enough, but we don't know. And the risks are so high here, in terms of actual potential for war, that you have to do it all, in my opinion. Both military deterrence, economic deterrence, diplomatic actions as well, to try to get as much leverage as possible to influence his mind. That may still not work, right? But at least you've tried.
The unidirectional entanglement one is a really interesting one because it sort of like acknowledges the fact that like China's the 2nd largest economy, but drawing where those, but like in order to have unidirectional entanglement in one way, like you have to actually still sell stuff to China, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think kind of like drawing exactly where that line is.
So let me give you an
Yeah,
example,
yeah,
right? So for example, on chips, I'm perfectly willing to sell them almost any chip except the really advanced GPUs to China, right? I just don't want them to manufacture them, right? So I want them to keep that dependence. On AI, I don't want them to build AI models, but I'm perfectly willing to sell ability for them to use our AI models under constraint guardrails where, they can't use it for military and other national security purposes. They can't use it for surveillance of their own population. But if they want to build a calendar
yeah.
scheduling app, use a chat GPT, knock yourself out, right? I'm not trying to, or use it in medical advances and the like. I'm not trying to cut off them from using any of those technologies entirely.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we have control over it.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a really interesting example and something that I think is going to come to a head sooner rather than later. Like, probably the most like innocuous version of like China getting access to AI models is like whatever Apple is going to have to do to, upgrade Siri and make their phones competitive. OpenAI right now, you can't access the API in China. You can't even like access ChatGPT. But it was, you got all these information articles saying that like they're gonna either partner with Google or they're gonna partner with OpenAI, and like basically either American models are gonna be sold to like the hundreds of millions of Chinese who use iPhones, or Apple is gonna have to make a deal with DeepSeek or SenseTime or like God knows who else. That, not to completely shill for Apple, but like that seems fine. Doing a AI model deal that like helps increase, industrial manufacturing and efficiency, like maybe less fine. But I think these are the like difficult, like these are the sort of nuances that you're really going to want to be, going to be thinking about as, part of winning in these critical technologies. More likely than not is going to still have some sort of like trade and engagement with China in it for the coming
Absolutely.
decades.
Absolutely, right. And on medical research, there's no reason why we can't cooperate with them and do joint research and try to solve cancer together and the likes, right? So there's a whole slew of things where we should not be cutting off trade, and it's going to be helpful for both parties. And the vast majority of trade is not this, right? Do you know what the number one by value good is that we import from China? Any ideas?
It's probably like some agriculture thing. I don't know.
Toys.
Ah,
Toys. So you know what? I'm perfectly willing to keep buying Chinese toys as long as they're safe. I don't want lead in those toys, but as long as they're adhering to our safety standards, that's fine, right? But should we be selling them 3-nanometer GPUs? No. Should we be selling them, I believe, any semiconductor manufacturing equipment? Absolutely not. I think our policy should be no assistance whatsoever from us or our allies to any Chinese fab at any node. No equipment, no precursor chemicals, no masks, no photoresist. Cut them off entirely and let them figure out the entire supply chain for the semiconductor production industry all on their own, something that no country has ever done since the invention of this industry, right? And maybe eventually they'll get there, but that'll buy us time. They'll probably buy us decades of time, which you need to restore the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific.
I'm really embarrassed I got that wrong. Dmitri, like it's really striking. There are basically like, so you and Eric Schmidt are the two sort of well-off tech people who have taken the sort of China challenge like the most seriously, not just by, tweeting about it or whatever, but like really putting your life on pause and focusing on this, on this issue to a pretty dramatic degree. I'm, curious, like obviously there's like the Google connection between, him obviously and you and Aurora. But I'm curious, maybe are there other things that you think struck you two most directly, and like why aren't there more people who have like come out of industry or the tech world who are also taking up this mantle?
Well, I can't speak for Eric. Maybe both of us are just bored and have nothing better to do. I don't know. But, I got passionate about this because of my work in the cyber industry starting with Aurora, which was the first time ever that the broader public realized that the Chinese were hacking into our companies, stealing our intellectual property, and that led me to actually start Crowdstrike to focus on this issue and try to protect the American industrial base from what I called at the time was the greatest transfer of wealth in history. And the more I focus on this, the more I got to appreciate, back in 2010 and beyond that this was truly a confrontation of not just in the economic sphere, but the national security sphere, and became very convinced early on that we were in a Cold War that no one was taking seriously. I remember I was in the sit room in the White House after one of my early reports back in probably like 2011 days, highlighting what the Chinese were doing in yet another sector where they've stolen all this intellectual property and literally like almost pounding the table like Khrushchev in that sit room with the national security staff saying, guys, like we got to pay attention to this and getting basically the response of, meh, as long as they keep stealing, they can't innovate. I'm like, well, first of all, I didn't say this, but that's incredibly racist of you to think that the Chinese, we're somehow better off than the Chinese, that we're smarter and that they can't innovate. And just historically inaccurate because knowing from my background in the Soviet Union, you can absolutely steal and innovate at the same time, right? The Soviets stole the designs for the atomic bomb from the Manhattan Project famously, but they got to the hydrogen bomb all on their own with Sakharov, developing really, really great innovations there. And this has happened in a whole slew of areas where they stole technologies initially, but then build up incredible capabilities in some ways that have exceeded ours in areas like EW, for example, and so forth. So, this idea that, we didn't have to confront China and that we would always be ahead was just so dumb. And now, in retrospect, obviously, most people realize that it was incredibly naive and condescending, frankly, to the Chinese people. But that's what got me passionate about this, and then got me to look beyond just cyber. Cyber was a great gateway to this because you're dealing with every industry, whether it's defense, national security, technology, agriculture, and you're seeing the real world impact of Chinese intrusions. You're tracking back to what they're doing when they're trying to steal this data and how it's benefiting their own domestic industries and defense industrial base. So it gave me kind of a front row seat to all of this that made me passionate to focus on this full time once I retired from CrowdStrike. I don't know what motivated Eric. Obviously, he was there during the days of Aurora, but he's been focused very much on AI. I think for the last half decade, and I think probably that contributed to his eye-opening experience with vis-a-vis China.
And sort of the flip side, like why aren't there more?
I mean, the tech industry is pretty focused on tech. So few of them care about geopolitics. It's actually quite remarkable. Some do, and they're more in cyber than in other places. But outside of that, not a whole lot do. But there are some. Peter Thiel cares. Joe Lonsdale cares. But many people just want to solve problems and not care about the world, and they think that technology is the answer to everything. I'm not of that view. I think the geopolitics matter a great deal, and as the saying goes, if you're not interested in geopolitics is interested in you. But you have this very myopic view sometimes in the Valley that is not paying attention to anything, not just China, but what even happens in Washington.
So another thing I think people don't really like price in is like the power of the ideas and how cheap they are to upgrade. Like Silverado has like under a $2 million annual budget. SCSP is like, I don't know, mid 8 figures. And the sort of impact that the thinking has on these questions, which I, for my part, think are sort of severely like under like, criticized and analyzed, like seems to like have a huge upside. Is there some like, there's a lot of alpha here, isn't there, Dmitri?
I think so, but again, like it only is there if you care about geopolitics, if you care about the world, if you care about the prosperity of this country. People care obviously, but do they think about that every day? I tend to, because I'm an immigrant to this country. It's been incredibly good to me. I owe a lot of my success to this country, and I want to make sure that remains for the future generations. And I don't know that many people not just in the tech industry, but really most industries think about that on a daily basis. And I think that immigrant background is actually remarkably helpful. And I serve on the Homeland Security Advisory Council and for the Department of Homeland Security, and one of the people serving with me is the founder of Chobani, and he is an immigrant like me to this country, and also like very very passionate about these issues. Now he makes yogurt, right? It's not a national security resource, but because of his background, he cares deeply about those national security issues. So I think that plays a role into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because like people give lots and lots of money to political campaigns. And like you'd figure that like that, there's some connection there that you could like lean off. It's like, look, you care enough about your country to give tens of millions of dollars to like Biden or Trump. Like maybe these sorts of questions, like we're actually like giving money to upgrade thought has like a higher percentage chance of materializing because you do have a bipartisan consensus on all of these issues.
But look,
I don't
people
know.
have different priorities. And look, Joe Lonsdale, for example, he shares my views on China. But if you look at how he's spending most of his time and his philanthropic dollars, he started this organization called Cicero. It's focused on domestic policies, focused on improving education and the like. And that's a great goal, by the way. And people should be doing that, right? So I choose to focus on foreign policy. Other people choose to focus on domestic issues, and I think that's fine. I mean, this would make America great. That we don't all have to toe the party line and can spend our resources, whether it's financial or time, on things that we think are most important.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm just like sort of thinking back to like the Ford and Rockefeller foundations, which really centered a lot of their, um, you know, giving and thinking around these questions of global competition. And that just like hasn't been a thing that's materialized. But then again, I mean, like Ford had to die for that to happen too. So we'll
Yeah.
just wait a little
Well,
bit.
look, not all of us can be doing China talk, nor do you think do I think you want us to.
All right, I got some tail end cyber questions. Dmitri, you mentioned industrial espionage earlier. Like, one of my hot takes is like, as soon as China actually gets ahead, like of a technology we really want, like we'll stop being precious about this, and that like this line of industrial, not doing industrial espionage is like more sacrosanct than like stealing state secrets is just like not tenable in the long term. You have a take on that?
Yeah, look, I've argued for 15 years, as I first encountered it, that this was stupid. If you can't beat them, join them. And they do have intellectual property. And, I'm not a fan, as you read my book, of moralistic foreign policy. I think we need to be focused on our hardcore interests. I'm a realist at heart. So this thing of like, well, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail or steal their intellectual property does not resonate with me at all. But there are practical concerns around being able to do this. We don't have one state champion. If you steal intellectual property, who do you give it to? And the
The
challenge
Chobani
of
guy, I trust
yeah,
him.
exactly. Yeah, and I think that culturally also our intelligence community is very very distanced from the private sector in almost every area. So it's just hard for us to pull off. Now, if it becomes existential, we'll probably figure it out. But I think there's a lot of resistance, both on moralistic grounds that this is sort of beneath us to steal someone's IP, which I don't subscribe to. But more on practical, how do you actually do it?
Dimitri, do you have any like anthropological observations about, these mythical 300 people in Washington who decide foreign policy?
I mean, there's a lot of groupthink here for sure. A lot of resistance to new ideas that I found, right? And debate, and a lot of elitism too that I've confronted. Getting into the space of like the sort of like, well, who are you? Aren't you the cyber guy? What right do you have to speak about on China? And you're not someone who spent 30 years studying Mandarin. So why should we listen to you? I think it's changing, and some people are much more open-minded than others, but there's certainly a backdrop to this that unless you've done this all your entire life and lived here in DC for all this time and think like us, that you shouldn't be paid attention to.
Um, is it reasonable to expect, the model weights for GPT-6 to be secure?
I think it's going to be really, really difficult. First of all, it's code, right? It's really a file. So the idea that it can walk out the door at some point is, I don't think it's tenable, particularly when you think about the resources of a major nation state being applied to this problem, both from a human perspective, from a cyber perspective. And we're not really treating this right now as a national security resource, right? If we believe it is as dire as some people believe, particularly in the Biden administration, we should treat it like we treat, the nuclear weapons designs, right? Where anyone that touches it should be polygraphed, and we should be protecting with guns and tanks and the like, and certainly applying all of our federal government resources to the vetting of the employees at these companies. And we're not doing any of that, right? We're sort of telling them, well, you should do security better, but by the way, like, we're not going to help you to vet the employees, including Chinese nationals that you may be hiring, who may be great people and may have no interest in betraying the United States or their companies, but by the way, may have families there that could get coerced and they could be put in a really uncomfortable situation. And is the DOJ helping to address that issue? No.
This is the trade-off, though, right? As like, if you have a nation of immigrants, like, you kind of have to have a nation of immigrants, and it's
which is really important, by the way.
Yeah, and it's really tricky. Like, I mean, you probably saw this Bloomberg article about how, like, someone halfway through their PhD, like, didn't able to get through Border Patrol, who was doing, like, research on, like, protein folding or something, like, very innocuous and medical, and the worry that I have is, like, that story is gonna scare off, like, I don't know how many future founders and genius AI researchers. And sort of like, I think there is a real cost benefit analysis to, like, militarizing, like, algorithmic research with respect to AI too soon or too late. And yes, there is this industrial espionage thing, but, like, the reason this is happening in America is, you have all these foreign names on the papers, but they're all affiliated with U.S. institutions, and pushing that off too hard is really risky.
And by the way, I want to make it very clear, I'm not at all arguing for ethnic discrimination or national discrimination or racism of any kind. We are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants have contributed to this country. I'm an immigrant. We need to welcome immigrants. We need to welcome them in helping us develop these capabilities. All I'm saying is that you can be an immigrant to this country and work on our most sensitive intelligence matters. You can be a Chinese national that has come here, immigrated, became a citizen, and you're working in IC, and I've met many of these professionals that are really, really terrific, right? But you go through vetting. You go through polygraphs, you go through background checks, counterintelligence checks and the like, and then you become trusted and you become a member of the community and you contribute to it. And we may want to think about that model for this very specific issue of developing AI models, if we think that this is really this groundbreaking, revolutionary, world-changing. I'm becoming more and more convinced of that, by the way. I came out as a skeptic initially on AI, in part because I've spent a lot of my life doing machine learning and saw the limitations of that, but deep learning and where these neural networks have come with the transformers and so forth really are game-changing, and I have to admit that, and the potential is there for them to become quite groundbreaking. Now, I'm not a believer in AGI, that we're going to get to AGI anytime soon, but just bad people doing really nefarious things with these models is the problem that I worry a lot about. And if we really want to stop Chinese progress in this area, or at least make sure they're far behind us, we kind of got to treat this as a national secret.
Dmitri, you're only 43. Well, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, look, this is my first book, World on the Brink, that I wrote, and people are already asking me what's going to be the next book, and I say, in 2032, I'd really like to write a book of how the Cold War was won. So this is going to be my focus for the foreseeable future, trying to avoid a hot war, trying to make sure that this century remains an American century, which is really the priority for Silverado. And if one day I can sort of say that has been accomplished through my efforts and many, many others, of course, great. I'll find something else to do.
Is there let's do one Soviet Union and one US. Like, what sort of Cold War moment or discussion would you have loved to be fly on the wall on, both from the US and Soviet history perspective?
Oh boy. Um, I think the 1961 period is not as studied as the 1962 period, right? Those 13 days in October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it seems like we know minute by minute what was happening. But I actually think that the 1961 Berlin crisis was just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. And we've kind of forgotten that, I find, which is one of the reasons why I highlighted in the book, in the foreign affairs piece, and knowing kind of detail by detail how Kennedy and the administration were approaching this, how they came to this decision to defend West Berlin at all costs, including at the risk of nuclear war. I think we're just scratching the surface of understanding that, and also the decision on the other side of Khrushchev. And I have to be honest, my friend Sergei Radchenko just wrote this terrific book to run the world using the declassified Soviet documents. I've seen some portions of that book. I haven't yet read it. I've ordered it, so I'm looking forward to reading it. But I'm hoping to see it highlighting that particular period of Khrushchev's thinking of first escalating over the Berlin crisis and then pulling back, and what kind of caused the decision to build the wall and de-escalate in a way.
Sociological takes on the cyber world?
Look, I've said this 15 years ago almost, that we don't have a cyber problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem. And this preoccupation with cyber in isolation, I think, has actually been detrimental to the field, because at best, and you can see this now in the Ukraine conflict, at best, cyber is an enabler. It has some terrific capabilities, particularly in the area of espionage. My friend General Michael Hayden, the former director of NSA and CIA, called it the golden age of signals intelligence, right? Because of what cyber has brought to bear to that problem, where you're no longer just passively intercepting, radio signals and tapping into telecommunications cables, but you can actually go to the source of the data, get into the computer, see the drafts as they're being made, and so forth. But the ability of cyber to affect war, I think, has been way, way overstated. This idea that has been totally discredited, that I never believed in, of the cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11, just ridiculous, because we're much more resilient to cyber events than most people think. They can cause temporary disruptions. It's hard to have long-term effects through cyber, because at the end of the day, you can always turn the computer off or disconnect, right? That option always exists, and you can rebuild and
No, it
be
doesn't.
back online. But also, we have a lot of resiliency that I think is underappreciated. And spending time with the Ukrainians, going to Ukraine during the course of this war, it's been really illuminating in terms of the ability of the people to survive in the really terrible conditions, with no electricity, no running water, and not willing to give up. And that's why I'm going to have a piece coming out on this shortly in World War on the Rocks, about this blockade scenario that a lot of people talk about how Taiwan is going to surrender if China blockades them. Just total nonsense. Like, they're not going to surrender. First of all, things are not even going to get that dire in Taiwan with a blockade. Economically, they will be, but they have self-sufficiency in food. Yes, they import a lot of food, but most of the food that they import is beef coming from the United States. You can survive without beef. They have plenty of rice production. They have plenty of pineapples, vegetables, and the like. They're not going to be starving to death. Energy is a problem. They import 98% of their energy, but by the way, it's a tropical climate. They're not going to be freezing to death like the Ukrainians are. So this idea that the minute there's a blockade, they're just going to surrender and cheerfully walk into concentration camps for re-education is just utter nonsense. And we don't appreciate the resiliency of people across the world, really, not unique to any country, of being able to adapt to terrible conditions.
Anthropological takes on cyber professionals.
It's changing now. When I started Crowdstrike, our mantra was, you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem, right? That this is all about people, and understanding your adversary was really important. Attribution was important. Understanding their motivations was essential. And I got so much crap for that from literally the entire cyber field, where people were saying nonsense like attribution is impossible. Well, we know now it's not impossible. It never has been impossible. Or that who cares who did it? You just want to focus on blocking the attack. It's like saying who cares where the missile is flying from? You just want to care about the characteristics of that missile so you can shoot it down. Well, yes, that is important too, but where it originated from and what else may be coming is kind of really, really important, right? Whether you're in cyber domain or in the traditional physical domain. That has changed, not everywhere yet, but as more and more people from the intelligence community, from law enforcement have joined the profession, they inherently, of course, always knew that understanding the adversary is important, and the mindset has begun to shift. But there's still a lot of people that came to cyber from a purely technical background of just working on the bits and bytes, building code, and to them, geopolitics is like, who cares? I just want to write code, and those are the people that have traditionally pushed back a lot on this idea that geopolitics, attribution, and things like that matter in cyber.
Thanks so much for being part of ChinaTalk.
Thank you, Jordan.